It's with my greatest pleasure that I introduce the next keynote speaker of the AUTOML conference, Andreas Krause. He's professor of computer science at ETH Zurich, where he leads the Learning and Adaptive System group. He's a huge CV, but I think that we can cut a little bit short. So academic co-director of the Swiss Data Science Centers, chair of ATH AI Centers, and so on, Max Planck Fellow, ACM Fellow, Ellis Fellow, Microsoft Research Faculty Fellow. Honestly, like, I wonder if there's anything he's not a fellow of. He works at the forefront of cutting-edge research in machine learning and optimization, with one of his focuses being Bayesian optimization. His talk will speak by itself. Therefore, I believe that we are very much looking forward to Andreas' talk titled Machine Learning in the Optimization of Discovery and Discovery Loop. Andreas, floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for this kind introduction. And thanks so much for the organizers for having me here. It's always been great to visit beautiful Paris. And thank you all for bearing with us during the technical setup. Today I'd like to talk about some work that we've been doing on putting machine learning in the loop, in the optimization and discovery loop. I'm going to say what we mean by this in just a moment. And of course, this is joint work with a fantastic set of PhD students, postdocs, and senior collaborators, who I'll acknowledge as we go along. Okay, so you probably all agree that these are tremendous times, truly exciting times for working in machine learning and AI. Right, over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen leaps and bounds of performance improvements in specialized tasks, from image classification to language translations to increasingly more general tasks now in the context of generative AI. So you can ask chatbots to write rap songs about submodule optimization, or have them render photorealistic images of pirate ships battling the mother in a coffee mug. And of course, this is starting to really have enormous impact across a range of different domains. One I'm particularly excited about are potential opportunities in the sciences, and we'll talk about a number of applications of ML in the sciences. Now, you probably agree that most of machine learning, at least as it's practiced today, typically follows this pipeline where we would start with a bunch of training data, preferably a lot of it, right? Maybe input-output pairs that take some input and some label that maybe a human gives us, or maybe a next token that precedes, basically follows a sentence in natural text. And we would try to learn a model that maps inputs to outputs. And then we would hope that if you test this model on some data that is well represented by the training data, we can hope for meaningful generalization. But of course, data is absolutely essential for machine learning. And for a lot of applications, it's crucial where we get this data from. So maybe if you want to train language models, we can already train on all data there is, train on the whole internet and so on. But in particular, in a lot of applications, for example, in the sciences, we really have to think about careful experimentation, right? What data should we collect in the first place? And this is sort of a question that has excited me for much of my research career, the question of how we can put machine learning in the loop of data acquisition. I believe I preach to the choir here. These are questions that are very at the heart of the AUTOML community as well. Right, so we might think about designing algorithms that actively collect data to learn something about F, maybe to estimate it well everywhere, or to give us good prediction on some set of outputs we care about, or maybe just to kind of find good solutions, right? For example, optimizing F. And so over the years, we've not just done work on kind of algorithms underpinning these questions, but also engaged in a number of different collaborations, typically interdisciplinary in nature, that lead to different variants of these types of problems. So for example, we've been collaborating with roboticists on deciding where we should send mobile sensors to monitor water quality in lakes. Or we've been collaborating with the Paul Scherrer Institute. It's a large federal research center in Switzerland on using our techniques from safe Bayesian optimization to optimize their free electron laser. It's a large-scale scientific instrument. We're collaborating with Agroscope, that's the Federal Office of Agriculture in Switzerland, on kind of using these techniques to, for example, design experiments to learn kind of which crops grow well in which environments. And of course, this whole question of systematic experimentation, closing the loop and using ML and AI to kind of drive experimentation is very much at the heart of lots of questions in AutoML and in the sciences, where there's tremendous opportunities now in the advent of robotic equipment, self-driving labs, quote unquote, that help use AI to drive the scientific progress itself. Now, this conference is all about AutoML. You hear lots of talks about applications in AutoML. So I'm not going to talk too much about applications in AutoML. You're all experts in this, but hopefully some of the algorithmic ideas that we're going to discuss are very relevant to this field. So instead, I'd rather talk about some of these scientific applications. And in particular, I'll talk about some work that we've been doing with our collaborators in using ML and AI to kind of drive experimentation in protein engineering, particularly in directed evolution. And so the idea would be to take a wild type protein you might find in nature and modify it, right, by introducing some mutations, swapping out one amino acid for another one, or swapping out a bunch of amino acids with another one. And now the hope is that these mutated proteins do well according to some criteria. So for example, we're interested in optimizing catalytic reactions. I'm going to talk about some applications in using directed evolution to find kind of biocatalysts that replace certain catalytic reactions relying on rare metals or fossil fuels, for example, through these kind of biocatalysts that are much easier to produce. Okay, and so now the question is, which of these experiments, each of which require wet lab experiments, are pretty expensive to acquire, should we carry out in order to find kind of well-performing sequences? And of course, there's lots of challenges along the way. So for example, what can you learn from past experiments that you've carried out, maybe with similar enzymes, or maybe with different substrates, for example, different reactions? Or how can we kind of use in silico calculations, right, molecular dynamics and the likes, to kind of inform this search, right? And sort of reuse information where we can get it, right, to kind of build useful models that generalize well. Here's sort of a super simplified kind of one-dimensional cartoon, right, of this protein fitness landscapes. You might have a bunch of different proteins on the x-axis, some notion of performance, maybe catalytic throughput, or maybe thermostability, binding affinity, in sort of a drug design context, kind of different abstract notions of performance. And we have some sort of function that varies over the space of possible proteins. And the problem is, of course, we don't have kind of a nice closed form to access it. We can only carry out some experiments in order to learn for it. And of course, we don't necessarily care about estimating that landscape well everywhere. We typically care about kind of finding where it works well. And many of you have recognized this picture, right? It's very similar to systematic experimentation and hyperparameter optimization, architecture search, and the likes, right? Maybe we don't have proteins on the x-axis, but maybe different neural architectures, for example, right? Or different hyperparameter sets, some design spaces on how to parameterize an AutoML pipeline. And maybe the performance is not catalytic throughput, but maybe performance in some validation set or some other performance measure. Okay, and so now the key issue with these and many other applications, right, is that we don't have a nice closed form, right, for this protein fitness landscape or predicting the validation set performance, right? So in some sense, it's really sort of a black box, right, that we can experiment with, subject to some input and get some noisy response, right? So maybe if we input some point xt, we get some noisy measurement yt, that's the function evaluated plus some noise. And let's not worry too much about the noise. It's assumed some sort of like zero mean sub-Gaussian IID kind of nice thing. And so typically what's often the case is that evaluating these objectives is expensive. And so we want to really be careful which experiments should we carry out. If you train machine learning models, it can take many hours. If you do these wet lab experiments, it can be very time consuming and the likes. And of course, eventually you want to find good solutions quickly. There's various different ways of defining what we mean by that. One notion that's often looked at in the literature is the notion of regret, that in a way looks at the opportunity cost of not knowing what the optimal function is. We've been doing quite a bit of theoretical work in this context. I'm not going to give an overly theoretical talk here, but happy to talk with you more about this afterwards. And so basically boundary regret typically not just guarantees convergence, but also convergence guarantees that we sort of uniformly make progress over. So here's another sort of conceptual cartoon that I think is sort of important to think a little bit about. So what would one often do in kind of machine learning? Maybe one starts with a bunch of data and fits a model to it. Maybe if you have little data, we can only afford to fit a simple model to it. And now we would use it in order to maybe tell us which direction we should go, maybe which next experiments we should go, right? Maybe you go in the direction where kind of we predict our performance to increase and collect a bit more data like this. Now, of course, these days, right, maybe we have a lot of data and can afford sort of a more complicated model that we can fit. On the other hand, right, we still only see kind of a subset of the space that we might care about, right, where this model is kind of sort of where our training data well represents what we care about. But if you think about things like scientific discovery, right, we really want to go where no one has gone before, so to say, right? We want to make predictions about how some other enzyme we might be able to engineer might work, right? That means we really want to stress test kind of machine learning in some sense, want to use it where it's known to be bad at, right? Because of course there's many models that perfectly interpolate our training data, and give wildly different predictions on this test set, right? And so maybe in the absence of knowing something about the domain, right, it's sort of impossible to kind of get meaningful predictions at this test point. But if we can't get accurate predictions, then of course, one thing else we could try is to at least try to quantify the uncertainty in our prediction. And this idea is at the heart of a field called Bayesian optimization that I think many of you know about. I still want to give a bit of an introduction because much of the talk later will build on these concepts just to make sure everyone is on the same page. So please bear with me if you're already a BO expert, okay? And so what's the idea in Bayesian optimization? Well, the idea is to quantify the uncertainty in this unknown objective, right? Maybe with some probabilistic model, and then use the uncertainty in order to inform the search procedure, right? So to deliberate between exploration, carrying out experiments that reduce our uncertainty, and exploitation, honing down the solutions we believe might work well. And of course, to make this work, there's at least two things we need to get right, namely how do we quantify uncertainty, and how do we use it in order to guide experimentation. And both of these we'll talk quite a bit in sort of the latter parts of this talk. Okay, and so typically this is done by what's called an acquisition function, right? That inspects this probabilistic model and tells us how good different designs would be to navigate this exploitation dilemma. Okay, now let's start with the first question, kind of what probabilistic model we might want to use. So generally, kind of as a Bayesian method, right, we would essentially have the philosophy where we treat this unknown function as a sample out of a Bayesian prior over function, so probability distribution over functions, right? So one out of infinitely many realizations of some stochastic process. And as sort of a Bayesian model, once one conditions on data, one can do posterior inference, under which the posterior uncertainty contracts as we collect more and more data. Because there's many models one can use and that have been used in this domain. One that's used fairly often are Gaussian process models, right? Whose all the assumptions we're making about the shape of this unknown function are characterized by a covariance function, like a simple covariance function like this one here, like the squared exponential kernel. But of course, there's many other models. And we'll talk about kind of more complex models that you might try to learn from data in the later part of this talk. And so the second part is how do we use the uncertainty to navigate this exploitation dilemma? Here's another cartoon that might be useful. So imagine we've carried out a bunch of experiments shown by these pluses here, calculated our posterior, so credible intervals, and hoping that the model is well calibrated, hopefully cover sort of this true unknown objective function shown in this blue dashed line here. And so if this is really contained in our credible intervals, we can basically apply this following rationale, where we look at a pessimistic estimate of that optimal value, right? And if the model is well calibrated, then we might hope that the optimum is somewhere within these green regions here, where the optimistic estimate for the function value, the upper confidence bounds, exceeds this best lower bound. Okay, so that already tells you how one can use these models to sort of shrink the search space, right? Narrow down the search in some sense. Because there's various different ways of utilizing this idea. One way to use it is as a justification of this principle of optimism in the face of uncertainty. So what we could do is just pick the point that maximizes this upper confidence bound. So that's one potential acquisition function that's easy to implement in the context of GPs and other models, where you basically just linearly trade mean and variance or standard deviation, and that kind of naturally leads to this sort of balance between exploration and exploitation. Of course, one has to think a little bit about how to calibrate this trade-off, and there's quite a bit of theory that we and others have been developing over the years that actually guarantees convergence and regret bounds on that sort of algorithm. And here's sort of an early application of this to this field of protein engineering. And so this was the collaboration with Frances Arnold's research group at Caltech. So Frances Arnold is really a pioneer in directed evolution. So she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2018 for her pioneering work in this area. And so back in the days, we were working with Phil Romero, one of the former PhD students who's now faculty in Wisconsin, on using Bayesian optimization in this context. And so here, of course, kind of as a Bayesian method, the key requirements, right, is to really have sort of a meaningful prior, right, that in a way captures some assumptions about smoothness or regularity of this unknown objective. And so Phil thought quite a bit about kind of what's suitable inductive biases, covariance functions to use. He ended up with some structure-based kernel function that basically captures sort of prior knowledge that surface mutations would less strongly affect similarity than core mutations of this protein. So quite some domain knowledge that sort of one can build in through this Bayesian lens, basically. And that actually worked pretty well. So it gives not just pretty good predictions of where they had collected data, but also nice Gaussian residuals and tails and so on. There's a bunch of other kind of interesting technical questions that came out out of this back in the days. So typically you don't just carry out one experiment, but you carry out a whole bunch of experiments in parallel, right? Similarly in AUTOML, you typically want to run a whole batch of experiments in parallel maybe. And now the question is, how should you schedule this batch of experiments? How do you parallelize that search? There's some very interesting algorithmic questions one can ask and study in this context. And so here's some early experiments that they got now more than 10 years ago. And so this is basically, they start with a bunch of parent sequences. They basically create chimeras. So they would break these parent sequences, mix and match and reassemble to get kind of offspring sequences. And these are basically the design space that you can navigate. And so in prior work, they had collected basically a training data set of a bunch of sequences shown here. Some of them were better than the original parents. But then what they did in the first step is to basically train a machine learning model on that initial data set and use it to rank possible alternatives. And while on average, these did better, they didn't really find kind of sequences that were better than what they started off with in this initial data set, right? On the other hand, if you really systematically explore and go further out, right, using algorithms like what I've described, they're actually able to find sequences that were considerably more stable than what they had found before. Now, I think this is just maybe one of the first applications of Bayesian optimization really in this wet lab design context. Since then, there's been lots of work on using BO for searching of various spaces of molecules, very successful materials design, lots of different applications. So it's super exciting field. Here's some recent work that we've been involved in. And so this is part of the NCCR catalysis. So that's a research cluster in Switzerland trying to find more sustainable alternatives for common catalytic pathways widespread in industry, but less reliant on non-renewable feedstock like fossil fuels or rare metals and these sort of things. Okay, and so one promising alternative is, for example, to replace certain metal-based catalysts by enzymes, carefully designed enzymes that sort of exhibit similar properties. And this is one such models that our collaborators have studied. Of course, machinery has moved on quite a bit. Now there's all sorts of robotic lab equipment where you can do many more experiments with a much higher degree of parallelism. So there's quite a bit of improvement on the hardware side. And of course, now there's things like protein language models and all sorts of clever feature extractors that one can use in order to kind of define good priors and these sort of things. But the basic sort of machinery essentially stayed the same. And now with this kind of machinery, one can find promising sequences where the rate of outperforming the initial wild type sort of much exceeds that if one were to just do simpler search strategies like random sampling. And they were able to find kind of sequences that were had a substantially higher yield over the wild type. So this was published in ACS Central Science pretty recently. So I would argue that these are sort of classical applications of sort of Bayesian optimization. I want to make sure everyone is sort of on the same page. And now what I want to do in the rest of this talk for the remaining 2 hours or so, I want to talk about kind of some methodological challenges and systematically addressing some of the limitations and challenges in Bayesian optimization. And so one important one, of course, is where do the priors come from, right? And can we maybe learn good priors from data? Another one is Bayesian optimization is a black box method. Can we sort of, if you think about things like scientific discovery, right? Maybe can we sort of use ideas in BO, but sort of open up that black box a bit. And last, one sort of key limitation of Bayesian optimization is often kind of has sort of this connotation that it's hard to scale to kind of high dimensional input spaces. And I want to talk about how one can use these ideas to scale to very complex control policies in terms of input dimensionality by lifting some of these ideas from Bayesian optimization to Bayesian model-based reinforcement learning. So that's the plan for the rest of this talk. So let's dive into it. And so the first one is this question of where do our priors come from? And so reflecting back on the last, say, 10, 15 years of kind of deep learning and our foundation models and these sort of things, there's kind of at least two really important lessons. So the first one is, given enough data, kind of data-driven representations can often perform much better than sort of hand-designed features, hand-designed representations. That's one. And second, these representations are often transferable in some sense, right? So you can maybe train a model for classifying natural images and just using a little bit of data, fine-tune it on medical images. And we see this with kind of language-based foundation models all the time these days. So the question is, can we sort of build on that and use these ideas for uncertainty quantification, for ML in the loop, right? For things like active learning and Bayesian optimization. And so indeed, there's plenty of opportunities of sort of learning from related data. So for example, in these types of protein design tasks, oftentimes there's sort of many related experiments that sort of roughly follow the same pipelines. Instead of just solving one instance of Bayesian optimization, there's sort of many instances of Bayesian optimization involving, say, different molecules under different contexts, different substrates, different reactions, and the likes, right? Similarly, in AutoML, right, maybe you not just tune the architecture for one particular data set, but want to reuse information across many different data sets, right? So there are these certain questions are studied quite a bit in this context as well. Okay, and so now kind of the one question one might ask is, if you want to use Bayesian optimization, kind of can we learn sort of good priors? Can we learn transferable priors across different related tasks? And sort of the Bayesian paradigm lends itself very naturally to this question, right? And in fact, there's a technique out there, many decades old, for doing this. Let's call it hierarchical Bayesian modeling, right? So what we would do, instead of hand designing a prior and using it to do posterior inference, what we might do is we might step up a level in the Bayesian hierarchy and say, let's take a bunch of related data sets, right? And start with a hyperprior on the parameters of our model, and then basically perform hyperposterior inference to get a hyperposterior of our parameters, which then serves as a prior for downstream tasks. So for example, linear regression, one can try to solve many linear regression tasks with a shared set of coefficients and some sort of residual that is then specialized per task. Okay? And of course, the question is how to get this to work with modern large models, right, and deep models and these things. And so one challenge that arises there is, what's a good hyper prior, right? And so in kind of the low dimensional parametric regime, the prior doesn't really matter. Eventually you overwrite it. But in the effectively non-parametric regime, right, in deep learning and so on, the prior does matter, right? And the hyper prior does matter. And so the canonical choice that's most widely applied is to do things like put a diagonal Gaussian, right? For example, on the weights of the neural network. The problem is that this leads to very kind of unnatural predictions that often don't work very well. Inference becomes challenging and so on. And so instead, what we've been exploring quite a bit in a series of work is to kind of do inference directly on the function space. Okay, so instead of trying to learn kind of the parameters of some neural prior, we in a way want to directly learn kind of the stochastic process governing the collection of training tasks. Now, why would this be a useful idea, right? It seems like you replace a difficult problem by an even harder problem, right? Something that's kind of high, but only finite dimensional, but something that's sort of infinite dimensional. Well, you talk about kind of inference of stochastic processes, but in the end, all we care about for stochastic processes are their finite marginals. So basically, the joint distributions they describe over finite sets of points, and we typically don't even care about having accurate density estimates for these finite marginals. So if you look at the de facto standard approximate inference techniques out there, be they variational, things like Stein variational gradient descent and the likes, or various types of gradient-based sampling strategies and so on, the key object that they care about is the score, right? The gradient of the log prior. So if you can get that right, you're in business. Okay, and so we've been thinking about basically meta-learning essentially through this lens, right, of score estimation. So suppose you have kind of a bunch of training tasks. What we can want to do is you basically want to sort of learn the underlying stochastic process prior. And that means we want to learn kind of to estimate its finite dimensional marginals. So one-dimensional margins, of course, is just if you pick a point, you look at the function response at that point, right? Of course, multivariate marginals one can define similarly if you take maybe a pair of inputs x1, x2, and looks at a joint distribution, right? The bivariate joint distribution of the function response at these 2 points. If you were to use a Gaussian process, all of these marginals are Gaussian. It's a characterizing property. But in general, they need not be, right? There could be some other joint distribution. Okay, and so what we do is we want to kind of have a lot of flexibility and kind of use rich architectures for kind of predicting these joint distributions. And right, one natural model, right, that we've been experimenting with is just a transformer architecture. Allows to easily scale up, right? So large data sets has a lot of flexibility. You still want to be a bit of careful, for example, capturing equivariance towards permutations of the test points that characterize the marginals. This can play some tricks along those lines, but otherwise that's basically it. And again, we only need to get the score right? So, and that we can do using score matching, right? That's basically sort of the heart that what makes diffusion models work. Okay, so that's a quite flexible architecture that you can sort of train on benchmark tasks. And it actually works pretty well. So here are some examples on some applications that we care about. So here, this is on a task of tuning this free electron laser, the scientific instrument. So here, each session, each task is basically a tuning session, right? Or sort of a bunch of data collected from this instrument under a given context for a given application, right? A given point in time. And the second is basically trying to meta-learn an autoregressive time series prediction model. So this is data from the intensive care unit. So each task is a patient, and basically time series measurements of medical sensors that we model using an autoregressive model. And here, basically, the goal is to kind of meta-learn kind of a model that generalizes, that can quickly adapt using few samples to individual patients, to individual tasks in this case. Okay, and so not only does it give pretty good predictions compared to various other probabilistic and non-probabilistic meta-learning techniques like neural processes, Bayesian variants of mammal and the likes, but also use pretty good calibration. So, and of course, that's what you often care about if you really want to use the uncertainty to drive experimentation. So this is so far primarily empirical work. There's very interesting theoretical questions that for those of you inclined, I'd be happy to talk more offline, but I'm not going to go into in this talk. And so again, there's a whole bunch of applications of this. I'll show you some applications to robotics later in the talk. So here are some experiments on this basically transfer learning for protein design type of application. So here the goal is to optimize over a series of different enzymes binding affinity with respect to a particular receptor molecule. That's sort of the notion of performance that matters in this application. And so here, each task corresponds to a different receptor, a different target that you want to bind to. You want to reuse information across these related tasks. Right? And so there we compare basically standard Bayesian optimization using different models and different acquisition functions, GPs, Bayesian neural nets in this case, and sort of UCB or Thompson sampling as acquisition functions with and without meta-learning. And here, this kind of meta-learning can dramatically accelerate performance for these tasks, which is in line with kind of other uses of this machinery. Okay, so this is about kind of the probabilistic modeling parts. Now let's talk a little bit about kind of the using the probabilistic model for decision making, right? That's sort of the second important part in kind of Bayesian optimization. And so, and as already mentioned, kind of in a lot of applications where you might want to apply Bayesian optimization, it sort of would be nice to go beyond this black box. And so what I want to talk about is the kind of a perspective of how one can do this using the lens of causal inference. And so here, a motivating application actually comes from agriculture, and in particular using AI and ML to help making more informed agricultural management decisions. So of course, it's well known that agriculture is a significant driver of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a kind of major driver of climate change, but it's at the same time also destabilized by it, right? With rising temperatures, water need increases, and the viability zones of different crops changes across the globe, and so on. Okay, and so now, of course, it's lots of interesting questions of how one might be able to use techniques from machine learning and AI to at least maybe contribute to addressing these challenges. And so you can sort of think about agriculture really as a complex data-driven decision problem or control problem, right? Where we've the crop soil system that's of course affected by management actions like irrigation, fertilizer use, and the likes. It's also affected by factors outside of our control, like the weather, irradiation, temperature, and the likes. And of course, also kind of the genetic factors that capture the genotypical properties of the crops. And all of those, of course, affect the yield, but also environmental impact of the management strategies. And now, increasingly, we can get more and more data about these sort of processes, right? Both kind of satellite imaging from remote sensing, but also kind of different soil sensors and the likes. And I can really think about sort of closing the loop. So we have a larger project in collaboration with Agroscope where we're literally taking some of these algorithmic ideas to the field and actually recommending kind of experiments of what crops to grow. I'm happy to talk more about that offline later. But I want to talk about a particular kind of generalization of Bayesian optimization that's motivated by some challenges here. So a lot of these problems in agriculture involve not just kind of a black box notion of performance and a set of decision variables, but other structured variables that are in some causal relationship. And some of them we can observe. So for example, when you think about the crop yield, is affected both by soil moisture and leaf nitrogen in a heavily oversimplified example, or the leaf size maybe affect some phenotypical properties are affected by genotypical properties, right? Expression of certain genes that, of course, themselves are in a cascade of a gene regulatory network and the likes. And now, on some of these variables, we might be able to intervene, right? So for example, we might be able to irrigate or use fertilizer, or we might be able to carry knockout experiments in order to learn something about the underlying genetics. And now, all of these variables are sort of causally related. And the natural notion to think about there is the notion of a mechanism, right? Where basically which describes how these variables are influenced directly by their parents in the structural causal model. So in this case, the blue node, how it's affected by these nodes A and B, along with the intervention we might be doing, as well as some exogenous driving noise. So this is kind of the standard representation of a structural causal model. And now, what's maybe kind of where the generalization of Bayesian optimization comes in is that there's maybe some variables that we care about, right? Maybe we care about optimizing yields, right? Or certain phenotypical properties of the crops, right? To inform crossbreeding strategies, for example. And the trouble is that for a lot of these systems, these mechanisms are not very well known. All right, so at best, you can sort of carry out experiments to learn something about these mechanisms. And that's the inroads of where we can use ideas from Bayesian optimization to come up with improvements. Okay, so maybe just as kind of a contrast, right? In Bayesian optimization, you would basically think about the reward directly being affected by the management actions that you would apply by the interventions, right, as a black box, versus in this generalization, one surfaces these additional causal variables, right, that only indirectly eventually affect the reward. Okay, and so how can one use ideas from Bayesian optimization? Well, so now, of course, the idea is we don't have a direct relation between the interventions, the actions we play, and the reward, but what we can think about is using these probabilistic models to model the mechanisms. So in this case, basically the directed arc between the yellow node and the blue node, right? That we can capture with the probabilistic model. It quantifies epistemic uncertainty due to lack of our knowledge, right? And then if we carry out experiments, right, maybe do certain interventions on a subset of those nodes that we have control over, we get observations of some of these nodes in this model, and then we can condition on them, right? And our uncertainty about these mechanisms contracts. And we can use this in order to drive experimentation downstream. That's right. And so basically to close the loop. Okay. And so in this ICLEAR paper, we describe kind of an algorithm that in a way generalizes GPU-CB to the setting. So it's basically an optimistic algorithm that, of course, now uses these cascaded sort of composed mechanisms and this interesting challenges of uncertainty propagation in this sort of context. We analyze it theoretically, so it turns out you can actually make use of this graphical structure and in certain cases really get exponentially tighter regret bounds that don't necessarily scale exponentially in the number of decision variables that are involved as you would get in Bayesian optimization with kind of standard assumptions. And this setting as such hasn't been studied in literature, but special cases have. And that's where we compare against existing work, and the algorithm is sort of competitive on kind of these special cases, but it generalizes, of course, now the toolkit to a much richer set of applications. So what I want to do is I'll tell you a little bit about how that algorithm works, but bear with me before we get there. here's a slight change of perspective, a different way of thinking about many of the problems we've discussed before. And so once we get there, I'll tell you about kind of the algorithm and how it actually works in this context. Okay, and so one can think about a lot of these problems, right, being from sort of protein design to this agricultural management problem by introducing an explicit notion of state, right? So maybe it's the conformation of the protein, maybe it's really the state of the soil plant system, and so on, right? That of course are affected by our actions, right? And some of these actions are maybe leading to higher reward than some others, but all of them, of course, affect the state of the system in some sense. Right? And we can sort of think about, for example, introducing a sequence of mutations in a protein really as a sequential decision task, in some sense, even if you do all these decisions at the same time, right? But effectively, we can sort of try to isolate the effect of individual actions that you might want to take. Okay, now the trouble is that for a lot of these applications, there's a lot of epistemic uncertainty about this underlying system. So this transition model, for example, how effectively the conformation might change, right? Or what exactly happens with the cell plant system is very hard to model explicitly. Sort of that's where the uncertainty comes in. But of course, and so I'm going to tell you about some of these ideas and show you some videos in the context of some robotic application where it's easy to try kind of these resulting algorithms. Now, many of you have recognized this formalism in the previous slide. We already heard some talk earlier today about it. Of course, it's an instance of reinforcement learning. You write out pretty much any problem as sort of a reinforcement learning problem if you think about it. It's sufficiently general. But of course, this abstract model of an agent that affects the state of the world through its actions with the hope to derive some reward. And of course, the key trouble is the agent doesn't know the world works, so it faces this exploration-exploitation dilemma. We've also heard about all the amazing success stories of RL, not just in gameplay, also in robotics. Our colleagues at the University of Zurich have been using this to race drones faster than human pilots. Our colleagues at ETH use this to have robots go hike in the mountains and so on. So it's pretty cool technology. So it's a pretty powerful hammer. It's not a perfectly ironed out hammer. So maybe AutoML has really something very important to contribute to getting its sort of training more stable. But it's a pretty powerful hammer. Okay. Now the trouble is that even though it's sort of drawn as this cartoon with the agent learning by interacting with the real world, that's really a lie, right? So the agent lives in a matrix, right? RL has been successful where you basically have a very, very good computational model of the world. They can effectively do it with simulations. And essentially all deployments of RL that I'm aware, or at least the vast majority, basically go like this, right? So we build a simulation, we train a policy, and we ship it, right? And hopefully that policy sort of there's various tricks one can play to get robust policies and so on, right? But typically the agent doesn't learn once it's deployed. But in a lot of these applications, so we don't quite know how the world works. So we might really want to use this to drive scientific progress, right? To kind of collect useful information. We need to kind of put RL really in this online loop, right? We need to actually think about collecting data. And of course, then we are back in the same motivation of sort of Bayesian optimization, right? Where maybe we can invest a lot of computational effort introspectively in simulation, in whatever model we estimate. But whatever we do in the real world counts. There we want to be really careful, right? Minimal samples, minimal experiments, maybe safety is a topic that we can talk about, and so on. Okay, and so that's what's been keeping us busy quite a bit in a series of different projects to basically really bridge this gap, right? To get RL closer to this online setting, right? Agent really gets to learn and improve while being deployed in the real world. Okay, and so that's basically the question is to what extent do lessons we know from Bayesian optimization get us closer to this goal? Okay, and so maybe one way to think about it, if kind of policy gradients and RL solving technology is kind of optimizing the acquisition function, then what's the acquisition function we should be optimizing? Okay, here's maybe also another connection to this, how is this related to this model-based causal Bayesian optimization. I think it's basically the same thing. It's an instance of this model-based causal BO, where basically the transition kernel is the mechanism, right? Going from one state to the next. And that's why also the algorithm is basically kind of using the same ideas. Okay, and so here's to build a little bit of intuition. And let's for now, just for simplicity, say, suppose the dynamics are deterministic. So all uncertainty is of epistemic nature. There's no aleatoric uncertainty, right? So the only thing we don't know is kind of what is the mechanism, but we know it's deterministic. So for example, you have a deterministic nonlinear dynamical system that we want to control. Okay, and so that means that what we can now do is we can basically build these confidence sets, right, using our Bayesian models and our probabilistic models to forecast plausible trajectories. And we can sort of try to plan that plausibly or maybe optimistically take us to the goal that we want to achieve, or some high reward region. Okay, but then of course we have uncertainty, so the world might not work the way we want it to work, but we collect some useful information, our confidence bounds contract, right, we become more confident, and we can plan better. Right, that's sort of the idea. Okay, and the question is, of course, how to make this work. And here's a way of how to make this work by using the standard kind of deep RL hammer, right? Policy gradient techniques like PPO, SAC, and so on, right? So the kind of machinery that has been used to solve these problems so we have a perfect computational model of the world, right? We want to be able to apply that hammer. Okay, and here's sort of the simplest possible illustration we could come up with a one-dimensional state space, the y-axis, that's our starting state. And we want to move up. We want to get to this goal state. The x-axis is time. Okay, so now what do we do is the following. So in RL, we pick a policy that prescribes which action we should pick. And now we have an estimated model, right, where we get a nominal prediction of where we might end up if we were to play that policy. But there's some epistemic uncertainty about where within these confidence sets we might end up. Okay, and now here comes the key idea. The key idea is to give the agent control over its luck. Okay, so we let the agent choose which of the worlds it wants to live in, right? In particular, what should be the consequences of its actions. Okay, so the agent can control where within plausible next states it wants to end up with. And that gives us basically an optimistic next state. And what's the most really important thing about this is all we did is we basically just reparameterized the dynamics, right? And for kind of confidence sets like elliptical ones or so, right, that you would get by using, for example, a Bayesian neural network that predicts a Gaussian distribution as an output, right? You would have this form. Okay, so we just reparameterize dynamics and enlarge the action space of the agent a little bit, right? Because it now gets to control its luck. Okay, and we can keep unrolling this over multiple time steps. Next action, nominal prediction, some uncertainty attached, optimistic next state, and so on, right? And after 3 steps, we reach the goal. Okay, so that's basically the idea. And so what's really cool about this is basically now you can throw the hammer at it, right? So now you can basically use policy gradients to optimize the acquisition function. So if you get auto RL to work, then that step gets even easier, okay? But this is the acquisition function that you might want to optimize. What you show on this paper is that kind of under some regularity assumptions, you can bound regrets of that algorithm and so on. But again, this is algorithm can actually deploy. So here's some simple kind of cartoon example, right? So these control tasks are nice illustrations often. Here's sort of this swing up pendulum as sort of a RL hello world task, where you can sort of illustrate this. So initially it's kind of in the swung down position. It comes up with an optimistic trajectory. Initially, the agent doesn't know anything about physics. It just knows physics is a little bit regular. And so basically believes by just pushing in one direction, it can swing it up, right? That's the swung down position. That's the swung up position. But then, of course, it quickly gets disappointed. So the world doesn't really work this way, but it collects a bit of useful information at sort of this swung down state. And then 2 episodes later, it knows that it learns that it needs to swing back before it can swing up, right? That's sort of what it believes, but it doesn't quite work this way, but it collects information on a larger part of the search space. And 2 episodes later, it basically is able to swing up. It overshoots slightly because it hasn't collected any data on the top position. But 2 episodes later, the optimistic and the real trajectory basically match, right? And essentially, then you've the upper and lower bound match, and you basically have found an optimal solution. Okay, so here's some demonstration, some robotics task. And so this is kind of a description of the task, right? You want to slide park this car. So basically, it's sort of meant to turn around and park like this. So that's a successful execution of the task. It's a little bit of a tricky control problem in the sense that you really need to slip if you want to solve it fast. And you need to model the tire properties carefully in order to get this right. So if you really wanted to build a simulator, it's certainly not impossible, but it's quite substantial amount of work. Okay, it's not just a point mass that moves around or so. Okay, and so you can run this algorithm I've described here, right? To run it over a series of episodes. Again, it knows nothing about physics, right? So the first episodes don't make any sense, right? But it's sort of collecting some observations. And after about 15 episodes, maybe goes in the right direction, about 20 episodes, it roughly sort of solves this task. So this is really basically learning this from scratch. So again, there's more computation involved, right? But basically the model has to completely figure out how the world works here, right? So it has to build this model completely from scratch. Now, you might say, if you come from control engineering, is, hey, this is a completely silly way of solving this problem, right? So here's kind of what one should maybe do. And so one natural way of sort of addressing this problem would be to really start with the first principle model, right? Maybe a physics-based model, some ODE, fit parameters to the data, system identification, and then use this estimated model to derive a feedback controller, right? Like MPC, dynamic programming, and the likes, and then execute that controller in the real system. But the problem is, if we get the model wrong, then of course there can be sort of a sim to real gap, right? So you might not be able to solve the task. We would get this at one shot, right? So it's purely based by prior knowledge. But maybe if it doesn't perfectly describe the world, maybe, right, it doesn't completely solve the task. And so the question is, can we sort of get the best of both worlds in some sense, right? Not learn physics from scratch, right? But at the same time, having the flexibility of these data-driven models without having to specify kind of every little detail of how tires like slip on the particular floor that the car is over. Okay, and so that's why I want to close the loop of the talk, right? So let's bring back the first part about kind of this meta-learning probabilistic modeling. And so the way we've been addressing this is to basically kind of use a simulator to, in a way, characterize our stochastic process. Okay, so what we do is basically just do domain randomization on different environmental constants of the simulator, generate all sorts of plausible physics, right? And then basically just use it to estimate the score, and then train a Bayesian neural net using functional Steiner variational gradient descent as kind of our model. So the simulator basically completely only acts as a regularizer. Right? So basically, you kind of learn a data-driven model, but it's regularized in a way to roughly look like simulations. That's essentially what it does. Okay, and so if you do this, then this is basically, after the first episode, it at least goes in the right direction. And after about 10 episodes, it basically solves the task and improves a little bit further over the next couple iterations. Here's some quantitative experiments in this IRS paper. So what we would do is first collect just a bunch of training data by manually driving around the car, take a validation data set. And here's kind of the prediction performance on the validation data set, just using SysID on a misspecified model. There, of course, you quickly find the best parameters, but you can't improve, right? Because the model is too simple. Here's this uninformed prior that starts off really terrible, but then eventually do better, right? If you give it more data. There's another kind of natural baseline sort of gray box modeling where you not only fit the discrepancy to the SysID model. So this starts off better, but initially quite poor because you don't know kind of what this discrepancy is. And here's kind of this simulation prior. And here's sort of the closed loop experiments, right? So really starting with the green model is basically learning physics from scratch. And the blue one is basically using this kind of neural prior that distills the simulator right into a training objective, and that's quite a bit better. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about. So I think there's many important research challenges still to be addressed if we want to realize the potential of machine learning and AI to advance engineering and sciences. And I think this community here thinking about putting machine learning itself in a loop to improve the performance of machine learning systems, I think you're addressing really crucial challenges that go much beyond AUTOML. So sorry for not showing any experiments on AUTOML here. You've seen plenty of those throughout the week, but hopefully some of these ideas are still useful this way. And I think really one key challenge that we'll need to tackle head on and be more understand better is how to do proper uncertainty quantification in this age of large models and foundation models. I think there's many important challenges. We talked about some of the ideas that we've been exploring in group. I think there's a lot more work to do and to scale up. And on that note, So we are lucky in Switzerland that the next generation supercomputer in Lugano is about to come online with a considerable number of H100 GPUs. And we're hoping that this will provide opportunities of engaging in such research at a larger scale in the Swiss AI initiative. So come talk to me if you're interested about that offline. So I conclude to thank all the amazing collaborators, all the amazing students, postdocs, senior collaborators who I got the chance to do this work with. All the funding agencies, of course, all of you for attending. I guess it's recorded. Here's the references just in case you want to read up a little bit more about that. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.